Hello, welcome everybody to the IHR Latin American History Seminar. I'm Tom Raff, I'm one of the conveners of the seminar. I'm going to be chairing it today. I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker for today, Diogo de Carvalho Cabral. Diogo is at the moment an assistant professor in environmental history at Trinity College Dublin. Before that, he was a Newton International Fellow at ILAS here in London, ILAS as was. Diogo is a specialist in the environmental history of Brazil. He's the author of, among other books, the 2014 monograph, and you'll forgive my Portuguese pronunciation, Diogo, which isn't maybe what it could be, Na Presença da Floresta, Mata Atlântica e História Colonial. And he's also the author of numerous other articles in journals such as Historical Geography, Landscape History, Applied Geography, the Brazilian Journal of History, and most recently, the journal Environmental History. And it's from that latter piece of research that Diogo is going to be kind of drawing on today for his presentation, I think. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Diogo today because we didn't cross paths when you were in London, partly because it just didn't happen, and also the pandemic started and the things started getting a bit chaotic. I'm also very glad to hear about this project because this year I was sort of experimenting with a new course in animal history in Latin America and looking around for really interesting, innovative research. And I came across your research and found it really, really interesting, very useful. And so I'm really happy to hear more about it. So what we'll do now is hand things over to you. And then at the end of your presentation, we'll be able to take questions. Over to you, Diogo.
Thank you so much, Tom. Well, thank you and the other conveners for the invitation. I was very, very flattered and happy to join you guys to talk about this project of mine. And I suppose this is me trying to combine the skills of a geographer, what I am by training, I would say, and that of historian, which I kind of became along the way. Let me share my screen here with you guys. Just a second. I hope you guys can see it. So yes, so this is kind of an aspect of my almost 4-year-long investigation about Lifcarienses and their role in the shaping of landscapes and the very history of Brazil. This paper is titled "Creatures of the Clearings, Deforestation, Grass Cutting Ants, and Multi-Species Landscape Change in Post-Colonial Brazil." So my most general argument in this paper is that deforestation, though of course highly destructive, I'm not I'm not arguing against that. So despite of that, it can be seen as a socio-ecological process through which humans negotiate their placemaking with the earth and its non-human inhabitants. So as I mentioned earlier, I combine geographical skills that I acquired in my basic training with historical skills of mostly qualitative document interpretation to analyze how forest clearing helped enlarge the range of Atta ants, the genus Atta, in Southeast Brazil over the 19th and early 20th centuries. So locally known as saúvas, these farmer ants grow fungus in underground nests using plant material they harvest themselves, including from human crops, an expedient that earned them the lousy fame of agricultural pests. Different Atta species have different preferences in terms of plant species, and some of them tend to cut mostly grasses, hence the epithet grass-cutting ants. So here in this paper, I focus on how what I call the savannization of forest landscapes fostered the expansion of these ants in the region encompassing the provinces of Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais. Still the economic powerhouse and political epicenter of Brazil. By 1825, well, let me just show you more, giving a zooming in on the Brazilian territory, show you guys the specific area I'm interested in. This is Southeast Brazil, and this area, the hatched area, represents the Paraíba do Sul river basin. Okay, I will be constantly referring to the Paraíba do Sul basin. By 1825, when the acclaimed emperor Pedro I signed a British mediated treaty wherein Portugal recognized Brazil's independence, the country was only a few steps from becoming the world's largest coffee producer. Stimulated by the contraction of post-revolutionary Saint-Domingue's economy, coffee cultivation had found excellent conditions in the Paraíba do Sul Valley, a 60,000 square kilometer watershed encrusted between two mountain ranges on the southeast edge of the Brazilian plateau. Its dry winter subtropical climate, as well as its proximity to Rio de Janeiro, the empire's capital city and largest slave port in the Americas, led to the valley's rapt occupation with large slave-worked plantations. Spreading southwest along the Paraíba Valley and then northwest, exploiting patches of fertile basalt-derived soils, coffee reached the so-called Oeste Paulista, Western São Paulo, by 1840, replacing sugar almost entirely in places like Rio Claro. In addition, the opening and improvement of roads connecting the capital to the uplands to the north and northwest stimulated agricultural settlement in southern Minas Gerais, which became a major supplier of livestock and dairy products to the rising metropolis. Whether for establishing coffee groves, staple crops, pasture, or constructing transportation infrastructure, people cleared forests extremely voraciously for pre-industrial standards. In São Paulo alone, estimates suggest that between 1854 and 1920, around 87,000 square kilometers were converted, or 42% of the province's original forest area. Although plowing would have helped eliminate or at least disturb recently founded leafcutter nests, it was neither feasible, given the fields full of stumps, nor deemed necessary by the rural folk. Their only instrument for planting was the hoe. After a few harvests, farmers slashed and burned a new forest tract, leaving the old plot to secondary succession. In addition to circumventing the chemical depletion of soils, this was meant to escape the leafcutter infestation. As Gabriel Soares de Souza had observed in the late 16th century, I'm quoting, "In newly cleared lands, there is no end to damage anything." End of quote. Cassava and Indian corn, the two most important starch crops grown in Brazil, are heavily targeted by leaf cutters, especially the former, especially cassava. Over half of the yield in cassava monocultures can be lost due to ant defoliation. As forest regeneration progressed over the years, however, nest densities tended to decline, allowing the farmer to return to the same plot and restart the cycle. But even though functioning as a sort of forest rotation, as Bavarian naturalist Karl von Martius called it, Sweden agriculture could and often did hamper forest regeneration when fallow cycles are shortened to less than 10 years. Packed in large leather bags, the coffee beans were shipped to coastal ports on muleback. Slave and free muleteers conducted tropas, mule trains, of dozens of animals along dirt roads, negotiating their way up and down the mountains until finally reaching Rio de Janeiro and Santos, the two main coffee ports. Most of these roads were no more than tracks, precariously maintained amid dense vegetation by the traffic of people and animals, winding paths running through steep forested valleys and gorges. The English entomologist Hamlet Clark was surprised to see that, and I'm quoting, the great thoroughfare leading from Rio to the rich province of Minas was at best an unmade mule track, and at worst, which was always the case in the rainy season, a treacherous quagmire. The edge effects of such linear clearings tended to maintain roadside vegetation in early successional stages, a situation to which mule grazing also contributed. Atta founding queens are attracted by dirt roads, litter-free beds, and the greater resource of accessibility of roadside secondary growth. In his travel through the mountainous region at the border between the provinces of Espírito Santo, Minas Gerais, and Rio de Janeiro in the 1870s, Manuel Basílio Furtado, a physician and amateur naturalist, took note of the, and I'm quoting, the great amount of ant nests covering the roadsides, end of quote. However inadequate, these roads always attracted human occupation and all its environmental consequences. The early 19th century roadworks connecting the capital to the southern Minas, sparked a land rush that eventually led to the foundation of two of the most important coffee municipalities, Vassouras and Valença. The first paved road in Brazil, in fact, in all of Latin America, was inaugurated in 1861, connecting Petrópolis at the Paraíba Basin's southern escarpments in Rio de Janeiro to Juiz de Fora, the most prominent urban center in the emergent coffee economy of Minas Gerais' Zona da Mata, the forest zone. Underwritten mainly through British capital, railroads began to be constructed in the early 1850s. However, the network grew very slowly, with less than 1,000 kilometers of iron rails laid until 1872. Its expansion accelerated in the 1870s, with another 8,000 kilometers of rails implanted until the end of the imperial era in 1889. In response to the planter class's demand for lower transportation costs, most railroads were designed to link ports to inland cultivation areas with few interregional lines. Not surprisingly, construction was concentrated in the coffee-producing regions in the southeast. In 1882, over 70% of the country's total rail track were in the area encompassing São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Minas Gerais. But the railroad-led reduction in freight rates came too late to compensate for the curtailing of environmental services in the Paraíba Valley's coffee economy. The first line reached the Middle Valley only in 1864, already at the end of the region's golden years. Writing the previous year, an agronomic commentator from the Zona da Mata, the forest zone, stressed that there were, and I quote, many devastated states and with very little forest left for the plantation of coffee, despite the fact that only 25 years, give it or take, have passed since the crop's most active development, end of quote. Continuously advancing over forest reserves, coffee farms left behind what historian Stanley Stein called expanses of weed and saúva-covered hills. The planting of bushes aligned uphill which helped oversee slave gangs, was a sufficient invitation to soil erosion, but the ants underground toiling enhanced it even further. By funneling the infiltrating rainwater, the ant excavated tunnels produced water-saturated zones capable of detonating highly concentrated erosion along the slopes. In a matter of decades, hillside soils had their most fertile layers washed away, while rainfall declined and became more erratic, gradually making coffee planting give way to less exacting land uses, such as dairy farming, and a less resort kind of firewood collection that ensured forest regeneration would never had a chance. Thus, between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Paraíba Valley transitioned from a thriving slave-based plantation region to a degraded pasture land, supporting low productivity, almost scavenger-like livelihoods, with the only forest remnants standing at inaccessible escarpments. These degraded landscapes, of which there is an extensive photographic record, as you can see, these landscapes were thus depicted in 1926 by a novelist, Coelho Neto, with considerable first-hand experience. I'm quoting, "The old coffee grove withered on a hillside of dry, exhausted, and excavated land. With their twisted branches, the bare trees looked like inverted roots. Here and there, green leaves still resisted, but entangled with parasitic herbs, and the barren bushes spread, covering the trunks. Tall, tufted grasses released threads in the wind, and the dense turf, denouncing the weary soil's anemia, waved like a latent fire crackling." End of quote. So these were the kind of landscapes that agricultural entomologist Francisco Mariconi surveyed in the mid-20th century. His studies can help one understand the long-term impact of deforestation upon leafcutter biogeography. Tutored by self-taught pioneers like Mário Autuori, José Pinto da Fonseca, and Renato Leão de Araújo, Mariconi became the first Brazilian academically trained expert on leafcutter ants. Based on extensive fieldwork conducted in the 1950s and 60s, Mariconi published in 1970 As Saúvas, the first entomological treatise entirely devoted to leafcutters. This work included the first systematic effort to map the ranges of Atta species in Brazil. 11 species or varieties had their distributions mapped. Atta sextans, Atta sextans, Atta sextans rubrupilosa, Atta sextans pidiventris, Atta cephalotes, Atta opaciceps, Atta bispherica, Atta capiguara, Atta goiana, Atta levigata, Atta volanvederi, and Atta robusta. Rather than taking these range maps as a transhistorical constant that can be projected back into the past, I take them as snapshots portraying a situation or point along a multi-secular process of human-influenced biogeographical change. As this point is at least 70 years away from the deforestation processes addressed in this study, Mariconi's maps must be assumed to reflect long-term responses to anthropogenic environmental change. This should not be a problematic assumption, as zoogeographical distributions are relatively resilient, taking some time to adjust to changing land use patterns. So that I could visualize the spatial relations between these range areas and other kinds of distributions, for example, forest cover, population distribution, I digitized and vectorized Mariconi's maps, turning them into georeferenced polygons. Then I analyzed these features against background layers of vegetation, roads, population density, and other related variables from the first national census, which was taken in 1872. The spatial analysis focused on the only two species mapped by Marconi that rely on grasses almost exclusively. Atta bispherica, known as Saúva mata-pasto, pasture killer. It is still known as mata-pasto among the rural folk nowadays. And Atta capiguara, known as Saúva parda, brown saúva, brown atta. Except for a small area in the central part of São Paulo province, their ranges did not overlap. Atta bispherica occupied the Paraíba Valley and the province's eastern portion, while Atta capiguara took up all the all of central western São Paulo. This biogeographic differentiation is probably due to environmental humidity, as Atta bispherica seems to be the most moisture demanding Atta species in São Paulo. However, differentiated in climatic terms, some places in western São Paulo receive as much as 4 times less rainfall than the Paraíba Basin's watersheds. Both species ranges encompass pre-colonial forests, suggesting they were shaped by new European activity to a significant degree. So this tries to show the presence of forest, right? The light gray in the background represents pre-colonial forest cover, right? And the colors, both the pink and the green, the most intense colors, they represent areas to which the saúvas, the Atta species, expanded, right? Because remember, they are grass specialists. Their presence in a forested area suggests that they were that they expanded into cleared areas, right? So along with each species environmental requirements, the most critical of which seems to be humidity, as I said, different spatial temporal patterns of forest conversion helped shape their ranges. While Atta bispherica populations responded to the pre-industrial clearings associated with 19th century coffee expansion in the Paraíba Valley and central eastern São Paulo, the spread of Atta capiguara populations is related to the railway-led coffee frontier that engulfed western São Paulo as of the turn of the 20th century. Despite these spatial temporal differences, both deforestation regimes share the same environmental outcome: savanization. Seasoned by years of traveling in Brazil during the late 1810s and early 1820s, the French botanist Auguste de Saint-Hilaire described the process by which forests were degraded into grasslands in southern and eastern Minas Gerais. I quote, "When in this region a virgin forest is felled and burned, the gigantic plants that used to be there are replaced by a forest made up of entirely different and much less vigorous species. If these new forests are burned repeatedly for planting in the midst of their ashes, then an enormous fetus, Pteris caudata, soon germinates there. Then in a very short time, the trees and shrubs disappear, and the ground is entirely taken by a viscous, grayish, and fatted grass, rather intolerant of other common plants in the midst of its closed stems, and which is called capim gordura, molasses grasses is its name in English. Therefore, the forest region nowadays encompasses vast pastures, but these, due to the vegetation's own nature, unquestionably indicate the place of destroyed forests." End of quote. Pervasive in the Paraíba Valley and other coffee zones, such an ecological transformation was already commonplace by the early 1860s, as suggested by an article that appeared in the country's largest circulation newspaper. I quote, "Everyone knows that once the soil has been depleted with coffee cultivation," wrote the author, "it no longer spontaneously gives any vegetation of much use. Just reeds, ferns, and more rarely grasses that cover the surface of the ground." End of quote. This was recognized by the most lucid among the coffee planters, those like Luís Torquato de Oliveira, who admitted that agricultural burnings left, I quote him, "the vegetable soil desiccated, compacted, deprived of the necessary mineral salts, sterilizing the land and rendering it suitable only for grasses and parasites." From its heartland in the Cerrado biome, so this area here in the blank spaces, not colored, are the area beyond the Atlantic forest biome. This is the savanna biome we call in Brazil Cerrado, right? So from its heartland in the Cerrado biome, Atta bispherica probably expanded south and southwest following the agricultural spread in central southern Minas Gerais and eastern São Paulo between the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It might also have been that the grass cutters benefited from the work of other Atta species that had either been inhabiting the region before them, or even before the first humans turned up, or reached there in the wake of early European arrival and landscape change. Today, one of the most widespread species in Brazil, which is not a grass cutter, but is indeed one of the most widespread, Atta levigata, it is incredibly generalist, with reports that foragers harness everything from rice and sugarcane leaves to cow feces and even cigarette butts. The clearings around Atta levigata nests are colonized by capim gordura, the molasses grasses I referred to earlier, the exotic grass frequently mentioned in Saint-Hilaire's travel journals, to which I will turn in a moment. Thus, Atta levigata might have been a pioneer following 18th century European settlement, laying the groundwork for the other species more specialized in grasses. In any case, if the crops cultivated were of the grass family, like corn or sugarcane, European occupation could be the basis for grass cutters colonization directly. In Minas Gerais, Atta bispherica probably took advantage of the expansion of Indian corn and other staples, the cultivation of which cleared much of the forest land used later for pig and cattle farming. In Pouso Alegre, a once predominantly forested municipality according to modern maps of primitive vegetation, Saúva Atta infestation was so acute that it intruded toponymy. In the late 1820s, a new parish, present-day municipality of Paraisópolis, was named São José do Campo das Formigas. Campo das Formigas meaning ants grassland. 19th century human-led deforestation had been fueling grassland encroachment upon the forest, paving the way for the expansion of Atta bispherica. Commenting upon Karl von Marsch's map of vegetation provinces, 20th century biogeographer Kurt Heueck argued that the savanna forest boundary had been wrongly pushed southward, thus encompassing, and I'm quoting Heueck, vast areas of old forests destroyed. Nowadays, these are abandoned areas. After a transient agriculture, these lands were transformed, covered by worthless grasses. They took on the aspect of a steppe. End of quote. This hypothesis is supported by the approximate overlap of Atta bispherica's 250,000 square kilometer range and the area of dense human settlement encompassing central South Minas Gerais, eastern São Paulo, and central north Rio de Janeiro in 1872. The 122 municipalities in which atavisféricas occurred contain about 2.6 million people, more than a quarter of Brazil's total population, at an average density of 11.6 inhabitants per square kilometer, the national average being 9.2. One quarter of this population, approximately 620,000 people, was made up of enslaved people and accounted for 41.2% of the empire's total, a result of the intense interprovincial flows that, since the termination of the Atlantic slave trade in 1850, had been draining off captive labor force from the Northeast. In the early 19th century, the core of this slave-based commercial agriculture region, as historian Ilmar Matos dubbed it, was Resende and Valença in the middle Paraíba Valley, and a few surrounding municipalities in São Paulo and Minas Gerais. It is important to remark that the ants were not mere passengers of environmental change. Their expansion was predicted on their ability to harness specific opportunities opened not by human doings alone, but by more than human assemblages, which are heterogeneous, unstable ensembles of actants with partial, overlapping, and conflicting degrees of power and effectivity. This is a quote from Jane Bennett, actually. Rather than something that humans did to the environment, savanization was an emergent process in which the effects, most notably the demographic success of grass-cutting ants, became infused into the very human organization driving deforestation in a way that the cause cannot be said to be fully different from the effect engendered. The assemblages undergoing such transformations also included grasses, of course, especially molasses grass, to which I will turn in a moment. Key to range expansion or dispersion modes, and the atta ants conveniently dispersed through the air. The life cycle of a colony starts with alates, sexually reproducing individuals that leave their parental nests for the mating flight, Isais or Tanajuras, the females, and Bitus, the males. This is the so-called revoada or swarming, the synchronized flight across several widely dispersed colonies at the beginning of the rainy season. It usually takes place on a day of clear, hot, and humid weather, preceded by a patrol of soldier ants, the largest of them, the most robust of ants, which secure the perimeter from predators. Tanajuras and bitus, males and females alates, come out of the nest for the first and only time in their lives. It usually happens at twilight to reduce the chances that both diurnal and nocturnal predators notice them. Then, spreading around the nest, they begin to flap their wings, rehearsing takeoffs. A female takes off from time to time, soon followed by several males. The frequency of such isolated launches escalates until it becomes a general movement. After mating with multiple males and storing all the sperm they can, the future ant queens land, rip off their wings, and start digging. Flying at an altitude of 120 meters, founding queens examine the terrain below, searching for the best alighting site. This is what experts call macro habitat selection, in contrast to pose-alike micro habitat selection. Of course, the most sought after characteristic is landscape openness, but this is not difficult to identify from the air, right? The same cannot be said of other environmental features such as soil and vegetation attributes, which must be deduced from certain clues. There is observational and experimental evidence strongly suggesting that the most critical clue for Atta capiguara and Atta bispherica foundresses is the presence of cone-specific mature nests. This makes perfect sense, as the higher the density of successful nests of one's own species, the higher the probability of environmental suitability. Interestingly, however, the more crowded the mature nests in an area, the higher the chances that newly arrived queens are attacked and executed by worker ants of those established nests, while the chances of falling prey to birds and other animals decreases. Alternatively, in sparser colonized areas, losses to predators predominate. This contrast might indicate an evolutionary shaped mechanism selecting for the queen's ability to calculate ecologically optimizing distances between nests. By ensuring that each nest is provided with enough resource hinterland, this trait would stimulate the spatial expansion of leafcutter colonization. In the context of rapid human-driven increase in the supply of deforested spaces, the fittest queen would pick a site midway between long colonized areas and newly opened spaces, thus raising the chances of environmental suitability while also meeting the minimum distance requirement. Thus, evolutionary and historical factors might have interacted to shape geographically sustainable ATA expansion. More importantly, though, upon colonizing new clearance, the ants surfing, so to speak, on the wave of human-led deforestation further transformed the landscape. And in doing so, they helped shape human livability. They added their own touch to the process of late 19th and early 20th century environmental change in Southeast Brazil, chiefly by competing with cattle for pasture, which weighed in on human farmers' decisions regarding which grasses to use. Mitigating ant herbivory was probably one of the ranchers' main preoccupations. Fortunately for them, several African grass species were dispersing rapidly in Southeast Brazil during the 18th and 19th centuries, the most important of which was capim gordura, the scientific name being Melinis minutiflora. This grass here. Although they eventually consume it, both Atta bisphaerica and Atta capiguara generally go for other species if available. And experimental studies indicate that capim gordura, Melinis minutiflora, is the grass least preferred by Atta bisphaerica. As grass planting was relatively rare, the consolidation of capim gordura pastures in previous savanna grassland mosaics toward the turn of the century can be interpreted as the stabilization of an assemblage that accommodated the interests of ranchers who kept economic losses within tolerable levels, Atta ants, which were allowed to spread over an abundant, though nutritionally deficient resource base, and of course, capim gordura itself, right? Traveling through southern Minas in 1927, Brazilian botanist Frederico Carlos Hahn noted the total absence of what he called truly virgin forest, reporting having only rarely encountered, I quote, secondary forests older than 10 years, end of quote. He also noted the widespread occurrence of capim gordura pastures, which dominated all but the highest, most inaccessible sites. In fact, capim gordura is arguably the greatest flourisher in this story, having become one of the most serious threats to the Brazilian Cerrado's native plant biodiversity. Exactly when and how it was introduced is unknown, although one finds reasonable guesswork in the literature. Warren Dean conjectured it would have been carried in the straw batting of slave ships, which is indeed likely given the sheer intensity of the slave trade and in the late 18th and especially the early 19th century. However, it made it to Atlantic Brazil. It found optimal ecological conditions there, especially in the highlands with their more temperate climate. Temperatures between 14 and 27 degrees Celsius are ideal for this grass, while frost generally kills it. Like the other African grasses introduced in Brazil, capim gordura was adapted to colonize disturbed forest margins. No surprise it did so well in the abandoned fallows of Southeast Brazil, where it quickly established itself as an invasive species. Capim gordura is a perennial self-sowing grass that can also reproduce vegetatively and tends to establish very, very dense mats, making it hard for other species to sneak in. It is also fire resistant, meaning it can regenerate from the remaining parts after moderate fires. Its very presence increases the amount of ground level fuel, which is crucial for fire spread. By augmenting fire proneness, capim gordura likely affected the savanna forest ecotones, hindering the establishment of tree seedlings. Its invasiveness was probably further potentialized by its association with atta ants, especially the already mentioned Atta levigata. So to conclude, throughout history, deforestation and other environmental modifications have helped humans create safe, food supply and trade-friendly landscapes. Nevertheless, the impacts of such placemaking upon non-human species have been enormous and often unpredictable. While flourishers are admittedly rare, this should not make us overlook the many different situations in which human-influenced landscapes boost rather than curtail other than human living. Thomas Fleischmann has keenly observed that, I quote, "The animals that thrive and flourish have as much to tell us about the Anthropocene as the animals that disappear." End of quote. This is so because the Anthropocene is not only about what we humans do, but also about what we enable or prevent other living beings to do. Landscapes are multidimensional places that connect the history of multiple species. By changing landscapes, humans alter the habitats of other species. There's also the conditions under which they go about make not only their particular histories, but the compounded and tangled trajectories we generally refer to by the capitalized form, history. Therefore, non-human flourishers are important because they will imperatively help shape our shared destiny. The multi-species character of this story responds to recent calls for co-constitutional approaches in environmental history. Not only humans and ants, but also exotic grasses like capim gordura were shaped by savanization, or more precisely, the socio-ecological swerve triggered, but not entirely controlled by modern European settlement and tropical forests. Though bringing particular biological and cultural legacies with themselves, each of these species, instantiated as regional populations, became with the others. They have been blown into concrete historical existence by their couplings with spatial-temporally contingent companions. While the carving of modern Brazil's economic heartland was its most visible side, the biogeographical expansion of native ants and African grasses were also constitutive of this story. So was the proliferation of the ants' parasites, the fungi they cultivate, as well as the many kinds of mammals, birds, and rodents that typically thrive in more open, savanna-like landscapes. This is not to deny the noxiousness of wholesale deforestation and anthropocenic biological ultra-simplification, but only to highlight that the specific ways in which biodiversity is curtailed and reconfigured are critical to how history is made. In other words, it is not just a matter of counting losers and winners, but much more crucially, at least for environmental historians, of why a few species get to take advantage of conditions that are unbearable to most living beings, and how these islands of success shape the human non-human entanglements. Thank you so much, guys, for your attention, and over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Diogo. That was a fascinating talk. So much to think about. Why don't we now open the floor to some questions from the audience? I think maybe while everybody's kind of gathering their thoughts and coming up with some questions, I might kick things off with just, I guess, more. I mean, I've got a bunch of questions which I'm looking forward to asking you. I mean, maybe the first one would be maybe, can you say a few words just to contextualize this story within the, within Latin America, or even within the world? To what degree are these ants a kind of particularly large problem in Brazil? And I mean, it seemed like Brazil was really at the forefront of kind of, production of scientific entomological knowledge about these ants. And is that because just the scale of the problem was unusual in Brazil, or some other reason? And I also wondered, to what degree do scientists and ranchers and farmers understand leaf cutting ants to be a Brazilian problem? In some sense, is the issue nationalized in some way? So that my first question is just about kind of putting it in that larger context.
Thank you for that, Tom. Yeah. Well, yeah, I should have said that earlier. Leaf cutting ants, the Atta genus, occur exclusively in the so-called new tropical area, right? Which is pretty much Latin America. The contours of the two regions largely coincide. And they of course distribute throughout Latin America, not only Brazil. There are a few species that occur only in Brazil, if I'm not mistaken, like 5 or 6 of them out of the 15 to 20 different species that exist in the new tropical region. In terms of their plague status, right? They have been considered pests, agricultural pests, from the very beginning of European colonization in the 16th century, right? I quoted Gabriel Soares de Souza, but there are other sources from the 16th century saying that some European crops, like vines, for example, could not be grown, at least with the scale the Europeans desired, right? They could not be grown with that scale because of leaf cutting ants, because they would, of course, defoliate the plants and make the crop impossible to grow. And of course, as the scale of European and New European settlement grew along the colonial period and the post-colonial period, the 19th century, right, with the growth, with population growth, the geographical expansion of population, especially into forested areas, the ants became more and more of a nuisance is too light a word, but it was really considered a pest because manioc, for example, the basic food for I would say pre-industrial, even nowadays. No, not nowadays, because wheat and other European crops kind of colonized the cuisine. But up until the 19th, the early 20th century, manioc was pretty much the most important starch crop in Brazil. It is very much targeted by the ants. So and of course sugarcane, cacao, all the coffee, of course, all the major export crops are and were defoliated by the end. So it was and is, well, it is not, I would say it is not anymore, it was not as huge a problem as it was in the past because of the advance of chemical means of combating them. There is a way of fighting them, which is, well, it is efficient, though it is very bad for the environment. It's like chemical baits that are put near the nest. The ants, collect the baits, carry them into their nests and contaminate, because it's toxic material. It contaminates the entire nest. So this kind of means lessen the considerably the impact of leaf cutting ants from the mid 20th century on, I would say. In terms of, you asked about science, right?
Well, I was going to say, presumably that's why this guy, Mariconi, one of the reasons he's mapping the populations is because it's not just for the hell of it, it's for the purposes of eradication or amelioration, right?
Yes. Extermination was the word they used. Extermination. And you asked that question very interesting. Like you said, was it seen as something Brazilian, right? Was it nationalized? How was it incorporated into the nation building process, right? This is interesting because there is a saying, a very famous saying in Brazil. Brazilianists hear it all the time. It's attributed to Saint-Hilaire. It goes like this: either Brazil destroys the saúva, the ants, the leaf-cutting ants, or the ants destroy Brazil. It is attributed to Saint-Hilaire, but it was not. It is one of those cases where words are put into somebody's mouth for very complex reasons. This was actually, this saying, this is kind of a, saying was created in the early 20th century by a novelist, Lima Barreto, the novel is a story of this guy who get disgruntled with certain aspects of Brazilian life and want to get back to some what he sees as roots of Brazil, and the ants are one of the enemies he finds when he kind of goes back to the land to cultivate food with his own hands. But anyway, the thing is, this saying kind of fed into this narrative of Brazil having to actually destroy exterminate the ants. Otherwise, the development of Brazil as an independent, politically and economic independent nation, right, a sovereign nation, would be impossible, right? We have to destroy the ants, and then with the so-called 1930 revolution, which put Getúlio Vargas in power, and the onset of this modernization process, there was actually a national campaign starting, if I'm not mistaken, in 1935, to exterminate, Brazil-wide the saúva, right? And this created a lot of different kind of sub-programs. You had radio airings with instructions to farmers of how to eliminate the ants, and you had like a national trope around this extermination, right?
Wonderful, great. Well, wonderful as in very interesting. Okay, so we've got two questions from the audience. Maybe let's take both of those. First one from Adrienne Calli. Are you there, Adrienne? Do you want to turn your mic on?
Hello, thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question, and forgive me, my internet connection stalled at a couple of points. So if you did cover this, I apologize. But I was really interested in how you were thinking the co-constitutional of the ants, the plants, the humans, and I was really taken by that. But my question was how you think about the ants sort of burrowing into the soil and the sort of soil, let's say the kind of biochemical dynamics of that. Um, is there an argument to be made for their contribution to sort of CO2 and problematic releases of certain gases that are already sort of, I mean, are they sort of a force multiplier or an intensifier of deforestation, sort of humans releasing CO2 and then the ants sort of participating, coming along and this sort of huge army of sort of micro CO2 disturbers? Is that part of the dynamic? Is that what they do when they're burrowing into the soil, that they're actually changing kind of biochemistry in this sort of vast network of processes? Or was that part of the argument that that you were making for this these co-constitutive processes?
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, excellent question. Yes, no, yeah. There is indeed study. There is at least one study about the contribution of leaf-cutting ants to CO2 emissions, right? And I'm not sure I will remember the exact figures. It is a scientific paper, of course. You know, it's experimental stuff, but they found out that nest soil emits something like 15 to 30% more CO2 than non-nest soil, right? So it can be indeed a problem if you think that, for example, in the Amazon, right, the wholesale deforestation that is taking place in the Amazon right now is actually favoring the expansion of leaf-cutting ants there, right? We don't have, well, at least I'm not aware of estimates like region-wide or even countrywide of the contribution of leaf-cutting ants to this to the emission of CO2, right? But in the very localized scale, experimental scale, scientists did find that they increase the emission, the CO2 emission. So yes, and I included that as a fact, in my argument, especially in the sense that, arguing that, yeah, we must look into that, because tracing this history might enable us to see what's coming, in miniature, of course, because what's happening in the Amazon right now, it's like it's like what happened in the Atlantic forest multiplied dozens and hundreds of times, right? Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I just think it's a wonderful way to rethink how human sort of networks and feedback systems with non-human actors are allowing non-human actors to be contributing to CO2 production, right? In essentially that the humans and the non-humans together are potentially contributing to greenhouse gases in a very interesting historical, geographical, sociological process, which is new to me as a way of thinking the kind of human non-human entanglements in how these are told by environmental historians. So thank you very much.
No problem. No, yeah, you're right, because one strong argument I'm making is about the Anthropocene, right? Because people tend to think of the Anthropocene in terms of what people do, right? Yeah, we're doing a lot of stuff. We are emitting CO2, but it also counts what we enable other beings to do, right? So
it's a much more interesting way of thinking in entanglement, and I appreciate that. That's helped me think that through. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's now take Paulo's question. Paulo, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Diogo, for this very interesting talk. I found that the aphorism you referred to, either we kill the ants or the ants kill Brazil, quite telling and very Brazilian in its formulation. But it sort of got me thinking about where's the sort of the collective memory of this experience, right? I'm wondering, people who experience this, these plagues, do they talk about it? Is there a kind of a popular culture around these ants that's reflected in, I don't know, stories and maybe, you know, any kind of cultural artifacts and maybe in oral histories of this region as well. So it's a question of, I guess, the cultural history of these ants, if you like.
Nice, thank you, Paulo. Yeah, great question. Yeah, well, I should make a distinction. For example, because when I talk about past and plague, and when I use these words, some people tend to associate with other kinds of plague, like, for example, grasshoppers, like locusts, right? Which are, you know, the kind of havoc they wreak is more catastrophic, I would say, because it's not constant in time. It happens like in 1 year and then it disappears for, you know, I don't know how many years, 10 years, and then it comes back. Like, but the leaf-cutting ants, they were there all the time. It was a bit, you know what I mean? It's a bit different of a past. It's a past which is also a neighbor, which is also a creature you're familiar with. It's really a companion. It is, of course, an enemy, but is a companion. You know, there is a quote from a state government report from the 1930s in Minas Gerais, if I'm not mistaken. So there's this kind of, you know, official kind of describing the agriculture in Minas Gerais, and, you know, the crops, the natural resources, and at some point he touches the ants, right? And he says something like this: yeah, the ants are a natural feature of Brazilian life. You have to kill them as you have to weed your fields, and you know, and plant, and you know, use the plow, or and I really find that interesting, because it kind of gives the sense of being something that is part of life. It is, of course, it was disturbing. It costed people money, it costed labor, but people saw the ants as really as companions, right? They were there, that you had to deal with them, right? And this is interesting because, as I was saying earlier, there was this huge nationwide extermination campaign, right? In the 1930s, 1935, I guess. And talking about extermination, it's kind of weird, because I don't really think that even the government guys they actually believed that it was possible to exterminate the ants. They were not, you know, dumb. They knew it was, and it is impossible to truly exterminate them. So I think it is this you know, this cry for, you know, for war. It was more like a ritual of, you know, of mobilization, of mobilizing the national spirit toward a common enemy, right? So I hope to be able to develop this argument, you know, sometime soon. But so I think when people talked about extermination, they were actually, it was a trope. It was a trope intended to mobilize the national soul. But, more to the point of what you asked about, the cultural history of ants, people ate and people eat the ants a lot, right? They fry them, and it's a delicacy in the interior of Brazil, in the interior of São Paulo. People love. I've never tried. I can't tell you what it tastes like. I have to try sometime. But people, eat the ants. People have, in the past, there are records of people using the ants to how do you call that? And Christmas time, there is that kind of a scenario describing the birth of Jesus. And how do you describe that?
Nativity, the nativity.
Nativity, yeah, the nativity scene, right?
Yeah.
So people use ants to represent, characters in the nativity scene. This there's an article about that. It's so interesting, right? It kind of shows how the ants, they were embedded in Brazilian culture, right? So yeah, I hope I have covered a bit of what you asked about.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
If that's not popular culture, I don't know what is. That sounds like popular culture to me. Michaela, you have a question.
Hi.
Hi there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think actually starting from your sort of last comment and story about the ants and the nativity, it's quite useful, because I was thinking about the fact that there's like several reasons why kind of your talk so got me thinking about a few different things, and one is like how active, right, the ants are in this sort of relationship. And so kind of going back to your previous remarks about the Anthropocene, you mentioned it in your paper, and then in one of the previous kind of questions, you said something more about it in the sense that, like, well, I guess my question would be how you think that this kind of active relationship, right, sort of changes, or I don't know, for you perhaps, if for you it adds or challenges or changes something about even using the idea of Anthropocene in such a sort of reductionist way in some respects. And I guess, the fact that, for example, the conditions, kind of the ecological conditions that you described before for the introduction of other species as well, were part of why human beings were able to then set off these processes of extinction at the same time. So it's kind of humans are doing that, but at the same time, they can do it because there is a responsive environment. And then, of course, the ants kind of as well. I don't know if you see what I'm trying to say. So the first question, I guess, would be maybe, I don't know, if you're interested in that kind of Anthropocene idea, if it's something that you think about through this work, and related to that, kind of in the area of kind of the extinction studies, or the idea of extinction itself. You talked about the fact that you're not just, or not so much in this case, interested in what's not there anymore, kind of in the absent species, but what's actually there. And so I was wondering, to me, it seems again that maybe, I don't know if you place yourself also in that kind of area, if you're interested in that idea of kind of staying with the trouble in some way, sort of how maybe this kind of case study can help us think through extinction as well, like how to relate to it, how we relate to it. I was thinking of, I don't know if you might have, it's a completely different area, but and also geographical area. What's her name? Juno Salazar. She's got this book on, she works on orangutans in Borneo, and the book is called Decolonizing Extinction, I think. And so just these two kind of areas and terms, how you see your work in that respect. Right, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Great questions. Yeah, and very complicated ones to answer. I'll try my best. About the Anthropocene, yes, I'm super interested in the Anthropocene discussion and super interested in kind of, well, as much paradoxical it sounds, but I want to kind of decenter the human in the Anthropocene, because there is a, well, of course, the Anthropocene is about humans doing stuff, is about our responsibility, both shared responsibility as a species and differentiated responsibilities as nations and classes. This is also important, of course. But so it is about humans, but is also, and perhaps even more important, about humans entangled in webs of relationship, right? That's, that the point I made about the Anthropocene being about what we enable and prevent other beings and other things to act in the world, right? I was, I've been reading a bit about this fascinating creature, the beaver, right? The beaver, and one of the most powerful, well, the biologists call them ecosystem engineers, right? Because species like the beaver, they, shape physically certain landscapes in a way that they concentrate certain resources in certain areas. They exclude other beings. And there are lots of studies evaluating how the dams that the beaver populations construct, how they influence microhabitats, for example, how they influence the population of beetles in the areas flooded by their dams, right? So they are speculating about the possibility of reintroducing beaver populations in areas where they have been extinct, right? So this is a core issue of the Anthropocene, right? Because both, our power of extinguish certain species, and also our power of reintroducing them so they can do some work, right? They can do some work to reshape the environment and to increase biodiversity or attract other species. The core idea for me here is that humans do not do stuff by themselves. They do stuff through, it's of course a Latourian idea, right? They do stuff through their webs of relationships. So I am very, very interested in this kind of discussion. More specifically in terms of extinction, I think it's important, in my specific discussion of my investigation of the ants, how the extinction, for example, of the local extinction, right? I'm not talking about an absolute extinction, but local extinction, for example, of certain birds that prey on the ants, how their local extinction is also favors the expansion of the ants, right? So it is always this very complicated panorama of generally lots of extinctions and a few flourishings, right? But you have to pay attention to which flourishings are happening and how these flourishings will influence the wider assemblages, right? Yeah, I don't know if I covered minimally your questions. I hope so.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's stuff that I think about as well. And just to add very quickly, if I can, because you talked about the engineering thing. I don't know if you're familiar with maybe it could be interesting to you, the idea of the trophic cascade. That is precisely about, yeah. So it's precisely kind of relates to that, sort of how reintroducing, well, I think it's older than that. I think the first to introduce it was Aldo Leopold. A few studies in the last 10 years or so about the Yellowstone National Park in particular. They've shown how reintroducing wolves, which obviously had been completely kind of eliminated from the park, actually made, the river beds and everything kind of completely come back to life. Yeah. So maybe that's something. Right, okay, thank you.
Oh, yeah, and you mentioned a book, right? Salazar's?
I can write in the chat.
Okay, great. Yeah. I did not get that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I think we've got one more question that from Tatiana Massaro in the chat. So I'll just read it out. Do you use the multi-species studies in your work? I mean, for example, Anna Tsing's articles and books. And if yes, could you talk a little bit about the kind of dialogues you are establishing in this case?
Thank you, Tatiana. Yes. Yeah, no, that's one of my greatest inspirations. Yeah, Anna Singh's work, as well as, of course, Donna Haraway, and the multi-species framework is particularly important to me. The kind of dialogue that I established with them is, Singh's latest papers, they talk about, I'm trying to recollect here the terms she uses. She talks about the relation between simplification, right, ecological and simplification, and I think she uses the term pasts or something like pasts, or not only insects that I directly interested in, but also weeds, and she uses a lot of the term weeds, right? And so yeah, I do use a lot this framework, putting in relation efforts to simplify landscapes, like for example in Southeast Brazil, right? The advance of coffee plantation, of cattle raising, it was a huge simplification of the ecosystems, of landscapes, and simplifications like that almost always elicit I don't want to say reactions, but they trigger transformations in the socio-ecological assemblages that ultimately result in the emergence of some very of some nuisance of species that thrive on those difficult conditions, and manage to expand, like the ants, like the grasses, like the capim gordura, and yes, of course, on a wider sphere, I draw a lot on her, or on Singh's idea of the human being, of the nature of human being a multi-species nature. You can only assess what humans are in a specific specific geohistorical encounters with plants, with animals, with soils, with climates, right? This is a very strong argument, is that underlies pretty much all her work. So I do admire that a lot, and try to to draw some implications, empirical implications in my own work. Yeah, I hope that answers minimally.
Great. Okay. Well, that's I think that may be, unless we have more questions, that may be a good point to tie things up. It seems to me that your work is kind of what you've talked about today, kind of telling a very unsimple story of deforestation and complicating it, but also showing how many people at the time, there was this, there was a kind of narrative simplification often of the process, people talking about leaf cutting ants as a natural problem and not fully recognizing, at least at the level of official discourse, kind of the degrees to which this natural problem was man-made in all kinds of ways. No, so yeah, really fascinating paper.
I love that, Tom. Thank you. Narrative simplification. I'll have to grant you co-authorship of the paper. No, I love that. That's a great observation. Thank you. Yeah.
I can't help but hear this story and think about other studies of how the Panama Canal and its relationship with the mosquitoes and malaria, or Timothy Mitchell's work on mosquitoes in Egypt. Really, and that's the kind of larger context I sort of connecting it to. But really fascinating stuff. Thanks so much for the talk and responding so fully to these to the questions. Let's please everybody join me in thanking Diogo for a really stimulating presentation.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much for the invitation, for listening to me very patiently, asking some brilliant questions. Thank you so much. Loved it.